Hi, my name is Shelby Redfield Kilgore, and I am the Korean adoptee filmmaker of all of these foster care and adoption videos on this YouTube channel. And when I have the energy and time, I may sometimes share about my health journey as a breast cancer survivor. And the reason why is because my health journey is so intertwined with my adoption journey. I have decided to start a new series when I am able to, where I talk about a book, a documentary series or a documentary, a TV series, a movie, a podcast, an article, any adoption media content where if it's fully centered about adoption or focused on adoption and foster care, I will give a recommendation and why. And also, I want to touch on pieces in the media that have an adoption storyline in it. So it may not be the focus. I want to share a detailed summary about the adoption storyline in those pieces because there may be people that have reservations about watching it that have a direct connection to adoption and don't want to be triggered from it. And so those, I'll definitely give a warning about spoiler alerts for those. And for those pieces, I won't give a recommendation to watch or not to watch. It's just so that you can have all the information that you need in order to make an educated decision to watch it or not. I tend to watch everything I can find with adoption storylines in it because I want to support those stories, and also especially if it's by a person of color. I want to make sure for transracial adoptees, international adoptees, to have representation and a diverse amount of stories to be out there. Today I'm going to talk about a book that I highly recommend. In fact, I think it should be a required reading for anyone considering foster care or being an adoptive parent or a legal guardian, and as well as anyone directly impacted by adoption. And the book is called Adoption Unfiltered: Revelations from Adoptees, Birth Parents, Adoptive Parents, and Allies. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's covered in the book and also some of my favorite quotes from the book and how I personally relate to some of what's included in the book. Adoption Unfiltered is broken into 4 parts: Adoptees Unfiltered, Birth Parents Unfiltered, and Adoptive Parents Unfiltered. And then the 4th part is Healing and Hope. What I love about this book is it is written by 3 people in the adoption triad: Sarah, an adoptee; Kelsey, a birth mother; and Lori, an adoptive parent. Sarah Easterly also wrote a spiritual memoir called Searching for Mom, which is something I've also read and I highly, highly recommend. Besides writing a spiritual memoir, she has written about adoption in essays and articles that have been published, and she created Adoptee Voices writing groups where she works with other writers and helps mentor them. And Sarah Easterly has trained as a facilitator in attachment and child development at the Newfield Institute. Kelsey is a birth mother and the director of advocacy and policy at Ethical Family Building, and she is also the co-host of a podcast called Twisted Sisterhood for birth mothers by birth mothers, the first of its kind. Lori is an adoptive mother, and she is also a writer, and you can find her work at lavenderluz.com. And she also is a host of the podcast called The Adoption Longview and the author of the book, The Open-Hearted Way to Adoption: Helping Your Child Grow Up Whole. One of the requisites for interviewing people directly impacted by adoption was that they had to have been really reflecting on adoption for several years and how it's affected their lives, personally and also in its entirety. it's a wealth of information, and I just want to say that I'm using the terms that they refer to themselves, because I know that sometimes using the term birth mother can be offensive to others. I love how the book led with an adoptee, because for so many decades, several decades, adoptees usually are silenced when they start speaking out critically about adoption, and also their conflicting emotions about their personal adoption, especially challenging the narrative about how adoptees are saved and that they should be grateful, so they should have nothing negative to say. And the dominant narrative has always been driven by adoptive parents about adoption and the adoption industries. While adoptees and birth parents, or I can say biological parents, that's the term that I usually use, and adoptive parents, all of their experiences are unique. There are many common threads that a lot of us all experience, and so that's sort of what this book takes a look at. And the authors masterfully weave their own personal stories with those of the people that they've interviewed, and also with the research that they have included in this book. And there's a little bit of history about adoption in the US. They also interviewed adoptees from international adoptions, and they touch on the foster care system and classism and religion and racism, and how those are deeply embedded in the structures created for what is supposed to be meant to be the best interest of the child. In Sarah's section, she talks about Dr. Neufeld, a child psychologist that she worked closely with. I love how the book gives an introduction to the brain science between the trauma, and that it is even before the child is physically separated from its biological mother. In 6 months in utero, the child's developing brain is at a stage where if mother is feeling trauma, so is baby. And I hope that with that information, that if you're new to the science behind the trauma in adoption, that you'll look further into other books. One of them is that I highly recommend, that I may focus on in another video, is The Body Keeps the Score. It's not solely about adoption, but it does talk about how trauma impacts the body and how it is lifelong. I know that there are adoptees that say that they haven't experienced any trauma from adoption, and of course their feelings are valid. In studying the neuroscience about what goes on in the brain of the baby and also the mother, there's science that proves that there is trauma, regardless if we remember. And trauma can be delayed, and it can manifest in different ways and in behaviors as we respond to the trauma that we may not recognize until maybe even until we're in our 60s or 70s. There's this term in the adoption community called coming out of the fog, and it's something I've talked about, and it's talked about in this book. I think it's just really important that we recognize the adoptees that are speaking about adoption in a very complex way, because adoption is complex. We can both love our parents and be critical of adoption. And I think this book really does such a great job about covering that. One of the adoptees talks about emotional safety and how it is so vital and important for an environment to be created when the child is growing up to be able to safely talk about adoption, whether it's good or bad. And that extends to when the child is an adult. If you believe and if you support your child in that adoption is a lifelong journey, then that extends into their adult years. One thing that Sarah talks about, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I want everyone to read this book, is the term chronically alarmed. It really made me think of my own childhood and how much anxiety I felt as even a very young child. I certainly personally related to Sarah and our trauma responses in the form of fawning, people pleasing. As a child, even though I had an environment to express about how much I missed my first mother and wanted to meet her and how much anger I felt, that was wonderful. My parents allowed me that space. But I had all of this anxiety and I just felt this hole in my heart. So this anxiety that I had living inside of me just drove me to achieve, because I wanted people to give me compliments, to praise me, because that's when I felt loved, even though it's temporary. And so in order to keep getting that, I guess you could say, high, I had to keep achieving and keep accomplishing, all driven by anxiety. I want to say that even for adoptive parents that do everything that they can, have read all the books, done all the research to try and help their child grow up feeling whole and navigating a tricky open adoption, I just want to say that even as an adult, they may have said as a kid that they felt whole and loved, but as an adult, as they reflect back, they may say otherwise, because there may have still been things that they weren't aware of or didn't feel comfortable talking to you with, and that you'll be ready to sit with them and to listen to them and to let them share and express themselves however much they want to, however much they need to, and to try your best to not center your feelings or weaponize your feelings to silence them, because it's too painful for you to hear the truth of how they feel. In the second part of the book, Kelsey gives a bit of history about adoption in the US, and both of them talk about the baby scoop era, where women between the 1940s and 1970s were coerced into relinquishing their babies for adoption, single unwed mothers. And Kelsey talks about when she was considering relinquishing her baby for adoption, that there was very skewed information out there. One of the things Kelsey brings up is the lack of support and education about after their child is relinquished. She talks about the trauma and the coercive tactics used to prey upon women in desperate situations. And also she talks about religion as well, and the messaging and how harmful it is for adoption, that there is power dynamics as well between adoptive parents and birth parents, and the adoptive parents always have the upper hand. My favorite part in her section is open adoption, how to navigate this very tricky and messy way to help your child feel connected to their roots, their biological roots, and how to navigate a relationship with the child's birth family, and what true openness means. Lori also talks about open adoption and what it means to be truly open, a truly spirited open adoption, and being in a place where, as an adoptive parent, you feel very insecure, and how to protect your child from those feelings and not to have your child be responsible for your feelings. She talks about attachment, and I thought this was really interesting, pronatalism. And they included an interview or anecdotes from an interview of a couple that was unable to conceive, and they were considering adoption. And they decided, based on all of the research they did about adoption, and that it had been a couple of years and they hadn't been matched, that they decided they were going to not adopt and to live their life as a couple without children. And in that face of societal pressure to have children, as this idea that couples with children are of a higher status than couples without, they challenged that. And I love that they included this story, because personally, my husband and I, because I was diagnosed so young with stage 3 breast cancer, we had to go through a whirlwind of making the decision to go through IVF and freeze our embryos before I started chemo, because chemo could affect my fertility. And I really thought, when it came close to the time of when it was safe for me to pause my medications to help prevent the cancer from returning, I really thought about why I wanted to be a parent. And I think that is so important for everyone. I think that's what's really wonderful about this book, is that it gives all the different perspectives with the help of professionals, experts in the field about attachment. It's so that we have a deeper understanding from everyone, so that we can be compassionate and give each other grace. And I want to read some quotes from the book that really stuck out to me, or just quotes that I think will really make you think. Sarah Easterly wrote that no matter how many adoptee voices I include in this book, I won't be able to capture or represent every experience of every adoptee, and not all adoptees will agree with all that is shared here. The futility has been hard to swallow, as has the fact that sharing mine and other adoptees' perspectives in print puts a timestamp on them, when the reality is that understanding adoption is a continual evolution for each adoptee. I always say, for me personally, adoption is a lifelong journey. I will be processing my adoption throughout the rest of my life. Sarah writes, child developmental psychologist Dr. Gordon Newfield explains, adoption is one of the earliest and primary disruptions in the continuity of connection, which can last throughout life. It doesn't end right after adoption. The facing of separation is developmental, and it will be there until the day you die. This quote is very personal to me, because I would describe myself as very sensitive, and I tend to cry easily. And people in my life had told me, you cry so much, or you cry too much. And so it always made me feel like I was too much for people. And so I would try really hard to not overwhelm them with my emotions. And so I felt like there was something wrong with me. And as an adult, I've come to embrace how in connection I am with my emotions. And crying to me has always been an outlet where I can safely let go of my anger, my sadness, my grief. And I feel a lot better after I cry. So I am not apologizing for crying a lot. But this quote, I'm really glad they included it. It's from Mr. Rogers. People have said, don't cry to other people for years and years, and all it has ever meant is, I'm too uncomfortable when you show your feelings. Don't cry. I'd rather have them say, go ahead and cry. I'm here to be with you. That's all I ever wanted, was just for people to say, it's okay to cry, and I'm here to be with you. I want to end with this quote that they included in Adoption Unfiltered. In The Wild Edge of Sorrow, psychotherapist Frances Weller says, it feels somewhat daunting to step off into the depths of grief and suffering, yet I don't know of any more appropriate way to undertake the journey of reclaiming soul than by spending time at the grief shrine. Without some measure of intimacy with grief, our capacity to be with any other emotion or experience in our life is greatly compromised. Adoption Unfiltered. Again, I think this should be a required reading for anyone considering adoption and anyone considering relinquishing their child to adoption. And for adoptees as well, that are just starting to look critically at adoption. I really hope that this book is widely read, not just by people directly impacted by adoption, but also by the general public.